It's been 10 years since Hurricane Sandy brought mass devastation to Staten Island's East Shore, destroying hundreds of homes and businesses while tragically claiming the lives of 24 borough residents. As the anniversary nears, the Staten Island Advance staffers reflect on the paper's coverage of the historic storm in the immediate aftermath of the event and the ongoing recovery and resiliency efforts that continue to this day.
You couldn't fathom what happened, and as journalists, that adrenaline kicks in and you just, start reporting.
I get down there, pull over, and there's tons of people walking around. You could see debris everywhere. There's maybe a fire truck, firemen, everything's wet. It's still windy out, there's overcast. It just feels like, not for cliche, it feels like a horror movie, a thriller, some sort of dystopian disaster flick.
I eventually, lost contact with my parents, so I was kind of scrambling, through any kind of means of contact I could think of. I know you mentioned earlier that our colleague Tracy was sort of taking phone calls from people, looking for information, and I was one of those people, and it was just like a really desperate, really, trying night.
I do remember looking out the front window of my living room and seeing the trees, which I was seeing bend in ways I'd never seen bend before, and then obviously the aftermath of it. I remember riding my bike around my neighborhood for a little bit and just seeing the complete devastation, and then I later volunteered at Newdorp High School, handing out some supplies and stuff and going around the neighborhood, and those images, I think, those are ones that'll definitely stick with me.
Welcome to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene, a podcast bringing you an inside look at the biggest stories on Staten Island with the reporters who cover them. I'm your host, Eric Bascom, and this week's podcast will be a little different than usual. Typically, we have one, maybe two reporters on to discuss our topic for the week. But given the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy and the profound impacts it had on Staten Island, we're going to do a longer episode and speak with 4 different reporters about what it was like covering the storm and the steps that have been taken since then to mitigate the effects of future inclement weather events. First, we'll be speaking with former reporter turned editor Tracy Purpura about her experience in the newsroom on the night of the storm and her coverage of recovery efforts in the months that followed. Thanks for joining me today, Tracy. This is the first time we've had you on the podcast in a while, considering your promotion to the editorial team, but I appreciate you coming on to reflect back on your days as a reporter.
Absolutely.
So before we get to the storm itself, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about our coverage at the paper in the days leading up to the storm and kind of how our expectations either did or didn't match how severe it wound up being. What do you kind of remember about the ways we were talking about the storm before it arrived?
First off, you have to realize we weren't a digital first operation at the time. Most of our stories appeared in print and then after would appear in online. So we were thinking that the storm would blow over. We knew that there was going to be bad weather. We had the usual contingency plans we would have when we know there's a storm coming and the types of stories that we would write. And we had I believe that night, everybody kind of went home at about the day before. I think it was a Monday, and everybody went home. And then as soon as we all got home, our lights went off. We had our nighttime crime reporter and a night editor working, and I believe they worked around the clock. We also had photographers out on the scene and capturing those first moments when the storm surge came in. And we really had, at the time, it wasn't as much people pulling out their iPhones and taking video. So we were looking on social media and Facebook for people posting things like that. But it wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So most people woke up the next morning. We had no power. Luckily, our newsroom at the time never lost any power. So that was great. But there were people who worked here who had lost possessions or their houses were flooded. So some people had a harder time than others to really get in. But we had reporters in all areas of the island after that. So we had out on the South Shore, on the East Shore, even some on the North Shore, because there was just so much devastation. It was just, you couldn't fathom what happened. And, as journalists, that adrenaline kicks in and you just, start reporting, and it was just mass devastation.
I know that you were actually in the newsroom, right, for some of this stuff, and so I'm curious kind of what that experience was like, what you were tasked with. I'm sure it must have been, very hectic, especially at that time. The newsroom was a little more robust. Everyone was there in person. Now we have a smaller staff. We have people working hybrid, remote, whatever it might be. But I imagine the newsroom on that day was kind of a mess, right?
Well, one of the things is the way we covered the news back then, too. We weren't equipped with laptops. We were at desktops. So reporters from the scene were not filing information. They were calling it into the editors. And everybody was calling things in. I was someone who was in the office doing a lot of the what we call write-throughs and getting information from everybody and just adding into the story. The biggest thing were there were missing people in the beginning. And it's not like we knew that there were 24 people dead in the beginning. It was one by one, and it was very sad and emotional to hear about another death. And it was just, keeping almost like a running list for people of the places they could go to get help, whether it was food, clothing, hot food, help cleaning out their homes, because some people they couldn't get the water out of their homes. And then there were people whose homes were gone. So it was just tremendous amount of devastation, and just employing all our resources to be out everywhere we possibly can to get news.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned, trying to kind of figure out what's going on in terms of people who are missing, how we can get supplies to these people who may be in need. And so on that note, kind of what were, in those, next few days afterwards, what were some of the paper's priorities in terms of coverage? What were the things that we were really trying to get done as quickly as possible? Because there's just so much to the story, right, that obviously you can't be writing everything at once. What was the biggest thing for us?
Well, the biggest thing was talking about the extent of the devastation, keeping tabs on people who had missing family members. I mean, we were getting calls from all over, I would say, the globe, because two of the children who perished, their father was an Irish citizen. So I remember getting calls from Irish newspapers. People were calling us just asking, do you know if my family's okay? And these are questions we couldn't answer. I haven't heard from my aunt, and she lives in Midland Beach, and we couldn't answer these questions. All we could do is we worked around the clock. Like I said, we never lost electricity, but had we had backup generators, and we were making sure those were working, and we just worked around the clock. It was the year there was no Halloween, because and everybody just stayed really late, and we all just tried to cover every aspect of it, and we looked at the people's, everyone's individual beats. So, people who normally covered transportation were talking about how there was no transportation, there was no gas. We were trying to help people. We were listing the gas stations that reported having gas, because people couldn't fill up their tanks. It was from every little detail you can imagine. We were just trying to get the information out there.
Yeah, and so kind of moving on a little bit from the immediate aftermath, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was some of your work highlighting the volunteers and community members who were really aiding in the recovery effort. So I know you did some features on many of those, I believe a full series actually, and so can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I did 2 series. They were the brainchild of the former city editor, Tom Kecky, who's now retired. One of them was called Faces of the Storm. I launched that right after the storm. And these were like kind of short vignettes, I almost want to call them, about just people and what they went through. So sometimes it might have been a neighbor who helped another neighbor out with their flooded home. I remember doing one on rescue workers who helped rescue somebody's pet, who was still in the flooded home after they had evacuated. And they were just people, and it was a lot of different stories. Some of them, who may have lost possessions. I think there was 1 or 2 about people who had lost loved ones, but we were also doing that separately as well. And then my second series came a little bit after, because I was covering business, was really looking at all the businesses that were devastated. And we made them more like a celebratory story, and to let the people know when they got back in business. So this pretty much happened, it was going on from maybe 3 months after the storm until 2 years after, reporting that people had finally found their way back into business.
Wow, yeah, it was certainly a long road to recovery for many of these people, and that continues today, unfortunately, and we'll be talking about that with some of our other guests. But, one more thing before we go. I've talked about this on the podcast a little bit before, but, reporting on things like deaths and natural disasters can take a toll on reporters, mentally and emotionally. And I imagine it was even more difficult for some of our staffers like yourself, who are native Staten Islanders, having to cover this sort of devastation in your home borough. So I was curious kind of what that was like. Was it difficult for you to process the fact that this sort of thing was happening on Staten Island, or were you able to kind of compartmentalize and just focus in on the work?
Well, as journalists, we just kick in. We just have to do it. And you didn't have time to think about it at the time. It obviously it was gut-wrenching every time we found out that someone else had perished. I think you're going to interview Mark Stein, but he can tell you about what one of the first deaths was, a teenage girl. And it's somber, but the thing that you want to do is you want to be able to tell the story. So, and sometimes the story involves having hard conversations with family members, but in most cases, what we're trying to do is tell the story of this person and how unfortunate it is that they lost their lives during a natural disaster. And there were a lot of stories that were very, very, emotional. People, two young children. At the time, I had a young daughter. It's like you can't even imagine what these people were going through. So yeah, there was definitely an emotional thing. But I guess as journalists, we feel that we're helping people by telling their stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Tracy. It's always nice to chat with you, and I'm glad we were able to get you back on the pod.
Thank you, Eric.
Next, we'll be joined by former reporter turned social media specialist Mark Stein to discuss what it was like reporting out in the field after the storm. We're back with our second guest, Mark Stein. This is the first time that we're having you on the podcast, but I'm sure many of our listeners are already familiar with you from your work on our Facebook Lives with Tom Robleski. So even though this is your first appearance on the pod, I know that we have someone who's comfortable in front of a mic and a camera, right?
Sometimes too comfortable.
Yeah.
We're not going to get any comments during this, right?
That's true. Yeah, you usually have to respond in real time, so this will be a little bit easier, I'm sure.
It's just you, so.
Exactly.
I don't think you'd be trolling me much, right?
No, I didn't plan on it. So one thing I wanted to ask you, which I also asked Tracy, our first guest, is kind of just what it was like for you on the day of the storm. I'm always curious to hear from people who were there because, although I am a native Staten Islander, I was upstate at college at the time when the storm hit. So I didn't really experience it firsthand in the way that other people did. So kind of just walk us through, what was that day like for you? Were you at work? Were you home? Were you out in the field? What do you remember about the day of the storm?
I'll have to pull you back really quick to the year before, in the summer, I think. End of summer, Hurricane Irene was projected to really do some damage in the area, specifically Staten Island, and it turned out to be somewhat of a dud.
Right.
So Sandy comes around the next year, and people are, some people at least, think, well, I don't need to evacuate. They were wrong last time. I'm not going to do it. Maybe my house got robbed, or I was concerned about safety with Sandy. So that Monday of the storm, I'm out and about, running into supermarkets, this and that. I work for the Shore section. We publish once a week, but I had to put together like 10, 11, 12 stories. And I figured, let me get some stuff now, even though this won't print for a few days after the storm, just to get a feel of how people prepared for it. Every supermarket was packed. I was talking to people in parking lots, getting a feel, and some people just had like M&Ms and chips and said, this is all I need for the storm. Other people had massive shopping carts. I was in and out. I was in the office, out of the office. But in the beginning of that Monday, people were sending us photos. A gentleman who lives on the South Shore, who eventually became Assemblyman Mike Riley, was just a retired police officer who was sending us photos of what was going on in his neighborhood and hearing things of what was going on. So he was sending us stuff. So early in the day, we had a feeling like this is going to be a big problem, for real. Day goes by, nighttime rolls around, I'm home that night, hanging out with my mom in my house, and lights are out. Listening to the radio, and you just know things are going off across the city. The Belt Parkway is flooded. There's a massive fire in the Rockaways, the Kennedys area, that decimated dozens of homes and whatnot. There's transformers outside blowing. You're seeing blue flickers all throughout. I go to sleep for maybe 3-4 hours. Wake up the next morning, and then it's like, hit the ground running. Go to the newsroom. The two guys that worked the night before are still there.
Wow.
Dean Balsamini, who was the editor, and John Anise, who was the reporter. He's now at the Daily News. They were working all night. There was no way they could have left, because of all the traffic, all the damage that came in from the storm surge and whatnot. So it was really a combination going into it of being home, in the office, and out and about, and then all the, the aftermath, which was horrifying the next day.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to get to next. I know that you were one of the reporters who were really out in the field during that immediate aftermath of the storm, and you witnessed that devastation firsthand. So can you kind of paint a picture for our listeners of that experience? What were some things that really stood out to you when you were out there and kind of assessing some of the damages?
It was a lot to grasp. I think back to the early start of COVID when the streets were totally bare. The Tuesday morning rolls around. I come into the newsroom for a few minutes just to see what's going on, point me in a direction. Obviously, I'm writing for Shores, but I know today, without even needing to be told, that I'm on breaking news. Like this is the story. This is what we do.
All hands on deck,
etc., etc. I find out from I think John, who was working, that hey, we heard something horrific happen on Yetman Avenue in Tottenville, which for those listening who might not be familiar with Tottenville, it's really, really at the end of the South Shore, off of Highland Boulevard. Like this person's home, the family home, the Dresch home, was about 50 feet from the water. The beach was right there. If you walk beyond the woods, there was the beach. They send me down there. It's maybe 8, 9 o'clock. The drive down, there's no one on the streets. It's the weirdest thing. I'm on the West Shore Expressway, and it's just me. Really strange. I get down there, pull over, and there's tons of people walking around. And you could see debris everywhere. There's maybe a fire truck, firemen. Everything's wet. It's still windy out. There's overcast. It just feels like, not for cliche, it feels like a horror movie, thriller, some sort of dystopian disaster flick. And I'm asking about this girl and father or whatnot that are apparently lost or missing or whatnot. And they lead me down the street. Just keep going down, keep going down. Really weird, like you got to walk to the end to really see the true wreckage. Like it's bad enough you've seen garages wiped out and homes banged up and wood in the streets and trash everywhere. But you get to the bottom of the street, people are either crying, they're just emotionless. Really, really crazy stuff. And you get to the end, I get to the end of the street, and on the left is just maybe 4 or 5 brick steps of a house, and there's like water shooting out of pipes.
Wow.
There was nothing left except for this, stoop. At that moment, I think there was still a search effort going on for the girl and her father. I think she was 13 or 14. Angela Dresch, I believe is her name. Mm-hmm. Was her name? It just hit you like a ton of bricks. It was as emotional a moment you could ever see. And that was just one facet. That was just the start. Because we would get calls, notices from funeral homes over the next few days about this person passed away, officials, this person's gone, this person's missing. Like a lot of the stuff coming through about that. And that's not even getting into the damages and the concern about homeowners and whatnot. But to paint the picture, to sum up the whole thing is, it truly was stunning of how something like this could actually happen that fast and without as much rain as they even expected. It was just the storm surge that smashed everything up.
Yeah, and I know that you were actually wrote the article about that young girl who passed away during the storm too. And I spoke to Tracy about this earlier. Our job can be really hard in some senses, dealing with death and devastation just on a regular basis. And then when you see it in your backyard in the way that we saw it in Sandy, it can be very difficult. So can you just tell me a little bit about what writing that story was like and having to tell the tale of these people who have lost their lives by speaking with their loved ones who are obviously still grieving?
I don't even think I just pulled up the story as we were going along with this. I don't think I did speak to anyone. I think we just had word from people in the area. I knew a lot of people in the South Shore because I covered the South Shore on a regular basis. I had covered crime and tragedy in the past, but my primary job at that moment was just kind of community news, businesses, transportation development, environmental happenings, parks, and the like. And that really allowed me to tap into a community in ways that other reporters may have not really been tapped in, because if you're covering a specific beat, geographically, it might not, the connection may be a little weaker than whatever I had. But I was able to get a ton of information. I found out where this girl went to school. The neighbors were really friendly. You would think at a time like this, neighbors might not want to talk to you. Go away, this is horrifying. I don't want to be bothered. But I think to some degree they were almost, it was like cathartic, relieving. It was necessary for them to talk about this person. A friend, the school she went to, I think was right up the street. So Yetman Avenue, you have an intermediate school and a public school right up the block. She went there. She was probably going to graduate soon, 13, 14 years old. people were a little chatty on the block. So we just kind of ran up what we had. I got back to the office. We wrote it up, and I think it was one of the first confirmed and identified deaths from Sandy in the area, especially New York. It was surreal. It was a story you never want to write. You know, you had to do it. You know, I'm grateful for the people that actually spoke to us during that time. And it really was insane. One of the things we had to do, or one of the things I thought about doing, was to show the before and after. I was taking my own photos back then, like we do now for the most part. But this is before everyone had an iPhone and everything. So I took a photo of the foundation or whatever was remaining, and I measured it against a Google Maps image. Wow. Like a street maps image. And we just sort of combined it to make a composite. And it's, you know, Monday afternoon, that house is there. And a few hours later, it's just steps. I haven't been back to the area in a long time. I'd imagine there's nothing left. I think the last story I saw, maybe the city or the state bought the property, because it's probably a place where not many people would want to live after that, especially with any sort of storm surge or anything. It was awful. It was awful. It was a story that we wrote. It was the first of many that involved people passing away. Within a week or two, I was getting obituaries to write on weekends about, you know, the mother that passed away, or the father that got stuck behind a door as the storm surge was coming in and he was unable to be rescued. Like, just horrifying examples of that. But writing that one it really was rough. It was not fun. No.
Yeah, it's very heavy stuff, and I know, you know, I've talked about this a lot with some of our other reporters, especially our colleague Joseph Ostapi, who does breaking news and does such a great job on lots of these stories where you have the tragic loss of a loved one and you have to go speak to the family members, right? And that's one of the most difficult things in reporting, at least it is for me. I know that talking to people after one of the most horrific, incidents of their lives is hard. But, you know, one thing that he always says is that it's so important for a lot of those people, like you said, to be able to tell that story and just kind of get it out there. And so while it's difficult for the families, while it's difficult for us, it really does have so much value to the people involved in it. So I commend you on kind of doing that great work, even though it was very difficult to kind of process at the time. So moving on, considering, you know, I wasn't at the paper at the time of the storm, I'm curious, just kind of in the days following, what was the news gathering and story building process of this all like? So when you were sent out, were you given specific angles or assignments to look for, or were you just kind of told to just go out there, see what you get, and come back and figure it out? Because depending on the situation, sometimes you know exactly what you're looking for, sometimes they're like, go figure it out. So what was it really like for you?
I'll give you two quick examples. In the days after, like immediately after the storm, the Tuesday, Wednesday, or whatnot, I think we had a story that must have 5, 6, 7 bylines on it. It's in, the print archives we use. And we just sort of had reporters stationed in different neighborhoods. Give us an update from this neighborhood. Have whatever photos you had, lay it out there, try to get any information you can about schools, just the atmosphere, what the cleanup's like, what the damage is like, what's this, that, and the other. It was really hard to keep track of because there was, think of the shoreline of Staten Island.
Yeah, of course. So many different neighborhoods.
You had a tanker wash up on the North Shore, and you had homes being just smashed into oblivion in parts of Newport Beach, Oakwood, Midland, Ocean Breeze, South Beach, Tottenville, Princess Bay. Whether they were the smaller homes in Ocean Breeze or Midland Beach, or the big mansions on Nicolosi Drive down behind St. Joseph by the Sea High School, there was a different feel, yet collectively everyone had their property smashed and loss of life and just extreme concern about what happens next with my home. Where do I live? What do I do? But on the other side, I did have a story about a month later. Newdorp High School was the site. This is maybe like end of November, so about a month later. There was supposed to be a giant assembly for people affected by Sandy, property owners. What questions are going to be answered? What sort of solutions will there be? Representatives from the city were there, the state. They had all sorts of, resource gathering cubicles set up, makeshift areas in Newdorp High School. And I had this giant assignment, go to there. We want you to put together 2 stories, pretty much a Q&A of what's answered from officials. Mm-hmm. And then try to get, the general feel of it and whatnot. So I'm like, all right, simple enough. The editors had this plan. They sent me in. Did not go as expected.
We've seen that happen plenty of times.
Did not go as expected because, and I guess we should have seen it coming to a degree, there was people had questions, but the answers weren't there yet.
Yeah.
So about 15 minutes or 20 minutes into this meeting, people are realizing it's like a packed auditorium where they had, I think, the aisleways had microphones at the end of them, so people could just come up.
Yeah, just come up and give your
Like
question.
at first it was questions, and then it just became storytelling.
Wow.
So of people like, what am I going to do with this and that? Well, we're sorting it out. We're still going to get back to you, this and that. We have counselors here, and yada, yada. And then it became, well, my house is gone. I'm missing this. And it just became like a, I don't know, what's the word I could use? Just like a gripe fest of sorts.
Yeah,
just sort
yeah.
of like releasing emotion and releasing concerns. So the story went from, I remember making a phone call in the middle of it, and I'm sort of standing on the stage to the side.
Yeah.
With, I guess, a gentleman that's now with the Archdiocese, but he worked in a assemblyman's office years ago. Like, there were some political employees who were not staffers up there that I was able to channel, like to work with, to at least talk to for some insight. And it was just weird seeing it from that point of view, seeing the people on stage have no answers, and seeing the people in the crowd completely lost for answers. So I call up the editors, and I'm just like, hey, we're not going to get that story. This is what the deal is here. And they're like, all right, just come back and write what you have. And it was just a story of we don't know yet.
Yeah.
A month later. And think about going 4 weeks
Truly.
without an answer on your property. An
Yeah,
answer
on your house.
Yeah, on your house. Where are you sleeping? What hotels? What's your work situation like? And you got to sit there. The stress from that, the stress from maybe surviving, a chance of death from the storm.
Right.
Reaching out and looking out for your kids, pets, employment, whatever bills. Do I pay the bills? Just a lot of things were up in the air there. And that was a month later. And it would take a long time for people to figure that stuff out. So it really was a mix of like figure things out, and here we have a plan, try and sort this out.
And then even when you have the plan, it might not
Right,
even
right.
might not even pan out how you think.
And the
it is.
last thing I'll throw in on top of this is there were a lot of rumors going around about, tons of bodies being washed up on the beach, in Newdorp or whatnot. A lot of hearsay. There's never any photographic evidence of this. Multiple people went on record saying that this is not the case. The fatality counts that we have are, according to them, officials. This is accurate. There's not some, massive unreported amount of deaths or mass graves near schools. So the rumor mill stuff was out there too, and addressing that was like another little facet too. And this is before social media was, it was big, but it wasn't. Like everyone
could
in
you
it.
imagine what that would be now,
Right.
and seeing all this content coming through?
Well, the one thing I always, and like I wish I see this, but for at least historical, documentation, is I don't think there's a video of the storm surge that actually tore through Staten Island.
yeah, it's difficult. And now you would have
have
you'd
so
have
many.
100 of them. You'd have people on Citizen live casting the storm from their window or whatever.
Or you would at least have the live video before, if they're hit by the storm, lose their phone.
Yeah.
I always wondered if people did have video and it was just washed away or smashed up by the phone. I don't know. But a lot of things were different 10 years ago than they are now, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one last thing that I wanted to touch on is that, we've seen in the wake of disasters that they kind of have this tendency to galvanize a community and bring people together in a really meaningful way. For example, we kind of saw that all across the country after 9/11. So I'm curious if Sandy had that same kind of effect on the Staten Island community where, regardless of their differences of opinion on politics or whatever issues it might be, that people kind of banded together in support of this common relief effort.
I can't even think about all of the efforts that happened underway. You had that 12-12-12 concert on a big scale for the area where you had the massive artists like, I think, Billy Joel, The Who, the Rolling Stones, all these people were there performing for fundraising purposes, but at least locally. The funny thing about working on Staten Island is you're covering this stuff, but this is also happening to people that you actually know.
Yeah.
A friend of mine had his family's from Midland Beach, born and raised there, and their house was heavily, heavily damaged. It wasn't like their foundation wasn't destroyed, but they had to pretty much gut the entire house inside and out and rebuild from the inside. So that Saturday, a few days after the storm, a bunch of us are cleaning out his house. And Midland Avenue, the whole Midland Beach area looks like sort of I don't want to say a ground zero, but a destination for people to just come and do something to help someone out. So you had people giving out like chicken and rice, water bottles, just handing it just happening. You saw all these people coming in with like certain shirts on of organizations where they're from that aren't from here, just helping people out, throw garbage out, move things. it was astonishing. It was really, really inspiring to see. As people had no idea what was going on with their futures and whatnot, like the work got done immediately. I told you before this, I'll tell you it again. As we're cleaning up, I think we didn't have as much equipment as we wanted. We didn't have gloves. We were missing gloves. So I wrote something on Facebook, hey, if anyone's in the Midland Beach area, if you could just stop by, maybe throw us an extra pair of gloves. Someone I had known was in the area helping another person clean up.
Wow.
Came over and gave us gloves. And it was just one example of many of people doing the right thing in the aftermath. And it really was, uplifting to see that. And honestly, it's expected.
Right.
When crap goes wrong, when a horrible situation happens, people of Staten Island usually do respond. But it was a wild time. We had an election, like the presidential election was a week later.
Right.
You're heading towards Thanksgiving. Halloween was quote unquote canceled. There was a ton. Imagine a table like this, just covered in Halloween candy, because the office was full of Halloween candy.
Oh yeah.
So there was food everywhere, and just working with everyone was so uplifting as well. Being in this field, being in this position to see and give answers when possible to during a crisis. It was the only place that had power as well for me. So I would just hang in the office even if I didn't have much work to do at the end of shifts. Like 2 hours later, I'd still be sitting in there. But I will say that weekend afterwards was, I'll never forget the Friday night I went out. My buddy who had his house pretty much demolished came out. We had like a kind of a good time. I'll put it this way. The Knicks just started their season. They beat the Miami Heat that night.
Right.
Every bar was packed. It was one of those we need to blow off some steam nights.
Exactly.
And my longtime colleague and Facebook Live partner, Tom Robleski, I'll never forget what he said to someone in the days following. I overheard him saying it. He said, it just seems like a lot of people are hugging now. There was a strong emotional response to it. There was a strong charitable response to it. The essence of community, whatever you want to describe it, it was there. And there's really nothing, even COVID can't relate to it because it happened so fast, like a giant spike, and then it just dropped. And then you just had this aftermath. So the reaction to it was amazing. But the moment was horrifying. The reaction was incredible, and I was proud to be there to help out.
Yeah, and it's always great to kind of see a community come together like that, and it's just a shame that we only seem to see it in these instances following a disaster. But thank you so much for joining me today,
Thank
Mark.
you, man.
It's been a pleasure having you on, and hopefully we can find a way to get you back on again soon.
Please let me know. Thanks. Appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you. Next, we'll be joined by Staten Island Advance public interest and advocacy reporter Paul Leota to discuss his experiences with the storm that devastated the neighborhood his family has called home for over a century. We'll be right back. The Mayor of Maple Avenue is a powerful multi-part podcast about Sean Sinesy, a victim of former Penn State football coach Jerry Sandusky, who was arrested 10 years ago for numerous child sexual abuse charges. The podcast series is written and hosted by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Sarah Ganim, who takes listeners into the world of addiction rehabilitation, where society can be quick to celebrate the consequences for abusers while not addressing the needs of their victims. Subscribe now to The Mayor of Maple Avenue wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me today, Paul. You've become quite the regular on the podcast, and I appreciate you coming back on to talk about a story that you have a very close personal connection to.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, so the first thing that I've been asking all of our guests is kind of just what their experience was like during the night of the storm. I know that, like myself, you were away at college at the time, so you weren't actually here in the borough. So what was that like for you being away from your family who, happens to live in one of the neighborhoods that was hardest hit by the storm?
I'm born, raised, will probably die in Midland Beach. I was away at college at the University of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And there we didn't really get a lot of anything. It just got really windy, wasn't a lot of rain. It's in the middle of Pennsylvania, so it's not like we're gonna get any kind of coastal flooding or anything like that. But I was in contact with everybody at home. Earlier in the day, my mom and I have always kind of, laughed at these types of situations, which usually we're right. But this time we weren't, and my dad was kind of extremely worried about the situation, and he was correct. But so I'm in contact with everybody at home, sort of throughout the night. And I'm texting and I'm on social media, seeing old friends, and you start to notice, I guess around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. It was really right around high tide here locally that things are getting bad. And I remember at one point, Buddy texted me that the church steps at St. Margaret Mary's in Midland Beach were underwater. Now that's like, I would say 15 feet up. So I was just like, at that point, I knew that something was, extremely wrong. And I eventually, lost contact with my parents. So I was kind of scrambling, through any kind of means of contact I could think of. I know you mentioned earlier that our colleague Tracy was sort of taking phone calls for people, looking for information, and I was one of those people, and it was just like a really desperate, really, trying night.
Yeah, it's got to be really scary. I couldn't imagine, like I said, I was away at college as well, but my family is located more centrally in the borough. We're over in Westerly. We're not on the coast like you are. So we saw, some heavy winds and some rainfall, but the storm surge, as we know, was really the biggest issue with Sandy. And so I wasn't clearly affected in the same way that you are. And it must have been kind of just so difficult not knowing, and just the kind of anxiety of waiting to hear from them. And so one thing that you mentioned in a piece for our recent climate series, Staten Island 2100, is that your family has been living in Midland Beach for multiple generations spanning over 100 years, right? And so you spoke with your grandfather on the night of Sandy about previous storms that had kind of ravaged the neighborhood throughout the years. So I was wondering if you can share a little bit about that conversation with us, and what some of your biggest takeaways were from it.
Despite my Italian last name, my mother's family is Irish. When they got here from Ireland, they settled in Midtown Manhattan, Kips Bay-ish area. But, as they lived here, everybody always wanted to get out of the city, and Midland Beach was a beach community, similar to, how parts of Long Island, Jersey Shore are now, resorts, that sort of thing. So, they found... It's just a random parcel of land. I think somebody that she knew who worked for the city, my grandfather's mother, put her on to this piece of property, and they bought it. And my grandfather had been, my great-grandfather had been a carpenter in Ireland, so he, built the houses, that sort of thing. And yeah, to one extent or another, my grandfather was born in 1924. To one extent or another, we have been there mostly as a summer home, but it's been, the primary residence for like my immediate family for my entire life. That night, I'm kind of freaking out, like I said, and I think like, oh, well, my grandfather's in Queens because he would summer in Staten Island. He wouldn't live there year round. But so I get him on the phone. He lived in an apartment building in Woodside. That was, I think it's 6 stories off the ground, so I knew he was fine, thankfully. But, I had him on the phone, and he was never, as he aged, he never got his, mental acuity was always top-notch, I'd say. But he just was not, for whatever reason, whether he was trying to, take my mind off it or what it was, he was not interested in talking about the situation at hand. Mm-hmm. But he starts going into it. He's like, yeah, I remember in the 30s and in the 50s we had storms similar to this. And I'm like, what is he talking about? This is ridiculous. I need assistance right now. I don't need a history lesson. But in retrospect, I think he was imparting some level of wisdom on me because that was always his thing. That we've gotten through this before. Everything's gonna be all right. In his own way of doing it. But yeah, so. When we started working on the climate series, I was like, you know what, let's finally look into this. Joe Stapiuk said, let's, go down to the library and St. George Library and, take a look at what was going on back then. So, but we found, dozens of news clippings, sort of, not every year, but maybe once every 5 years, there's these major storms on what we call the East Shore now. And it's always around October, November. And it's similar kinds of devastation that we saw during Sandy. Sandy undoubtedly, I think, is number one. But, it's cars floating along. It's people's houses getting swept away. It's something that has been a reality in that area for a very long time.
Yeah, I know it's something that we deal with all the time in areas like that, right? You're just going to be kind of predisposed to those types of inclement weather events when you're living in those types of areas, just like people who are living in Florida are going to be hit by more of these hurricanes on a yearly basis. So I just thought it was so cool and so interesting if any of our listeners want to go back and read those articles to see some of the old clippings and just kind of, because it felt very new and very like, oh my God, how could this happen here? We've never seen this before. But, when you do go back, we've had similar experiences, although, like you said, not necessarily to the level of kind of what we saw with Sandy. So another thing that I'm curious about is just kind of, what it was like when you returned home for the first time after the storm and saw the damage that it had done to your neighborhood. What do you remember kind of seeing and feeling during your first trip back?
A whole lot, to be honest. So I took the bus home from Scranton, like a Mart's, Trails bus kind of thing. And I got off at Port Authority in Manhattan. I eventually get home. I take the ferry. Actually, I think I might have treated myself to an express bus ride.
Oh, wow.
If I remember correctly. But I got off, and one of the things that sticks out for some reason is that on my block, so we live on Hunter Avenue, so it's Hunter and Highland. Councilwoman Debbie Rose is there. I just remember seeing her and being like, oh, I know who that is.
Yeah.
But she didn't represent the district, so I think it just kind of stuck in my head because it spoke to what a sort of universal response it was. But so first I went to my house, which is, it's a fairly big piece of property, but everything in the backyard was sort of just strewn about. I remember seeing like a dead fish in the alleyway and just being like, oh, that's different. And then I peeked in the house because, once I looked in, it was just like, oh, we don't need to go any further than this.
Yeah.
It was sort of that everything was just clearly, a total loss, and it just wasn't going to, most things weren't going to be salvageable in the house. But from there, I went to a friend's house, and we were all kind of commiserating, about what was going on, and we chopped it up for a while. But then eventually I left because my parents were staying at my godmother's house in Oakwood Beach, I guess, but they just missed it. Like, they just got basement flooding, thankfully. So they had just missed it. But, yeah, this is, like I was talking about earlier, these are people that I was in contact with, and they were eventually who got in contact with me. I'm like, oh, we found your parents. They were staying at, they got to the Betrides evacuation zone. But then, like I was saying, they were staying at my godmother's, and I walked to Oakwood Beach from Midland Beach, and my timing was off because the sun was starting to go down and all the power was still out. So I'm starting to see, like, in Oakwood in particular, there were like a lot of those "you loot, we shoot" type signs.
Oh.
Yeah. I remember one, I remember I could take you to the house where it was, which, like, it's a traumatic situation, so I kind of get people's reactions to that way. But yeah, it was quite an ordeal seeing, like, all the destruction, like cars strewn about, sand everywhere. Everything just seemed so sandy because, like, the ocean had literally come in.
Right.
And yeah, it was a lot to take in when I got back first. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure, and that was one thing that we spoke with Tracy about, just kind of the difference in seeing this type of devastation in your hometown and seeing it in your neighborhood, and how that's a little different, and it hits obviously much harder than it does when you obviously see these sorts of things on the news, or we see coverage of past storms that have affected other parts of the country. So I imagine that must have been incredibly difficult for you. And, just one last thing before we go, given that your family has been in Midland Beach for so long, and, you've mentioned in your article that you kind of want to stay there as long as possible. I'm curious just kind of how optimistic you are about the future of the East Shore, as some of the more bleak climate projections that our colleague Joe has written about kind of show that parts of it could become uninhabitable in the coming decades, depending on climate change.
It is definitely a concern. I think that, just sort of that we're at the 10-year. Yesterday I was on this, like, harbor tour with all different people from, like, the New York metro area. And it was a lot of the same stuff that, like, we're in the same position we were 10 years ago, more or less, which I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think governments are starting to understand that a lot of these areas are going to be losses. But, I'm going to stick with it as long as possible, I guess, which might not be the most responsible decision, but I'm allowed to be irresponsible sometimes. I have a penchant for it. But, no, we have a lot of theoretically a lot of projects in the works. The blue belts that the city's developed, those have really helped like mitigate flood risk in my area, which has been, great. In theory, we have the seawall, but I'm currently working on another story about how that's a problem again.
Right.
But, I think it's sort of a wait and see approach. We've had really bad climate projections for 40, 50 years now. And I always think back to the Al Gore inconvenient truth thing. We were supposed to be underwater by now, and we're not. So, I'm not like this anti-science guy, but it's just like, I don't know. I think it's hard to predict the future, and we're going to see where we're going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Paul. I appreciate it as always, and I wish you the best of luck in covering the upcoming elections.
Yay.
Next up, we'll be joined by our fourth and final guest, climate reporter Joseph Ostapiuk, to discuss the borough's ongoing resiliency efforts and whether Staten Island is better equipped to handle the next major storm. Thanks for joining me today, Joe. Given your role as the climate reporter here, I wanted to have you on to kind of wrap up our podcast on Hurricane Sandy, or as some would say, Superstorm Sandy, but I actually kind of wanted to start there. So what's the whole deal with the hurricane versus superstorm thing? Why do different people kind of use different terms to describe this storm?
That's actually a really good question, Eric. Throughout my reporting over the years, I've had people correct me saying, it was never a hurricane, it was a superstorm. That's not the case. There is actually no classification of what a superstorm is. Storms go from tropical depressions to tropical cyclones to categories 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and obviously 5 being the most catastrophic and tropical depressions being the least. It was sort of an unofficial designation given to the storm. I think that's something important to note. It's not officially a superstorm, but that's just what it was called, including in newsrooms throughout New York. Basically, the storm started like a lot of storms do in the lower part of the Atlantic, gathering up some warm water, and then it started to go north. And then the left turn that it took towards New York, it sort of collided with cooler air, and it sort of magnified its intensity, and that's how it sort of got the superstorm moniker.
Interesting. I think people just like alliteration.
It's fantastic.
Really
it is great.
It just makes for a better headline in some senses, I think. But yeah, so that makes sense. But before we dig into some of the resiliency stuff, which is why I kind of wanted to have you on, I wanted to ask you the same question that I asked everyone else, which is kind of just, what do you remember about the night of the storm? Where were you? What was it like to experience?
We were both in high school at the
I was
time.
Actually my freshman year of college, so I wasn't even here.
Oh,
in the borough.
I was in. I think it was my
senior year
of high school.
Yeah.
I was at home during the storm. I remember I lived in the Willowbrook area at the time. It's far from the coast, so I wasn't seeing flooding impacts. But I do remember looking out the front window of my living room and seeing the trees, which I were seeing bend in ways I'd never seen bend before, and then obviously the aftermath of it. I remember riding my bike around my neighborhood for a little bit and just seeing the complete devastation. And then I later volunteered at New Dorp High School, handing out some supplies and stuff and going around the neighborhood. And those images, I think, those are ones that'll definitely stick with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you've done some really great reporting as part of a special series that we released called Staten Island 2100, which talked about how the borough could be impacted by climate change in the coming decades. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that from a Hurricane Sandy perspective. And so obviously we saw how devastating Sandy was, but some of the stuff you reported on makes it sound like future storms could be even worse if current trends continue. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we definitely covered that a bit in the Staten Island 2100 series, talking more generally about climate and how it affects extreme weather. We actually had a more recent piece come out where I spoke to a couple experts who spoke to me about Sandy specifically, what scientists know about that, and how climate change affected that storm. Obviously, we had extreme storm surge and rising seas, things along those lines affect that. The process of climate change affecting storms is pretty interesting. Basically, in simplistic terms, a warmer atmosphere, as the Earth warms, retains more moisture. So if you're thinking about the atmosphere and how much water it can hold, the warmer it is, the more moisture. And then storms like Sandy or storms like we saw last year with Ida come through, and release that moisture. So basically releasing more precipitation, more rainfall than would normally have happened. We're seeing around 10%, 15%, 5% more rainfall than usual in some storms. And scientists are now able to figure that out pretty quickly. They run models and projections and computers that are able to do that. And in the same way, as I mentioned, rising tides also affect storms. So if a storm like Sandy comes through and sends storm surge into the coastline, obviously having higher tides than normal, even if it's only 6 inches, even if it's 8 inches, and we could be seeing that surpass a foot by the end of the century, and past 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, depending on how much more warming we see. So that greatly affects how much farther storm surge goes inland, and then therefore how much devastation can happen and how many lives it can lose.
Now that we know what some of the issues kind of are, what is the government doing at the city, the state, and the federal levels in terms of resiliency efforts to try to mitigate some of these concerns moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, but there needs to be more still. I think that's what the general consensus I have among experts I speak to, and even officials. Our colleague, Giovanni Alves, she actually did a strong job sort of running through these projects recently in some of our Sandy coverage. So some of those projects aren't even around anymore. I'm thinking about Build It Back. We also had buyouts of flood-prone areas, which experts tell me are very important, may even need to sort of pick up again as we see new areas that may be at risk, especially as tides rise, as I mentioned. We have the Living Breakwaters project, which is an interesting project, which basically serves as a buffer. There's pieces of infrastructure underwater that'll basically break up waves and beach erosion. That finally went underway, I believe, in September. And then obviously the expansion of our Blue Belt system, which is extremely effective and pretty widely praised. And then the East Shore Seawall. That's probably the one that's
that's the one we've been waiting for.
Yeah, it's probably the most important project, but it's also been the project most marred with delays. Our colleague Polio has been following that. It's an extremely important project. But it's also one that sort of showcases the difficulties in getting these things done. Sandy was 10 years ago now, and we're still talking about a project that's considered extremely important for our coastline, and yet it's still not even close to completed. So
yeah, I mean, parts of it haven't even really been started yet.
Yeah.
There's been we've talked about that on previous podcasts.
Yeah.
So if people do want to go back and listen, they can learn a little bit more about that. But moving on, one thing that I found kind of interesting in your reporting and in the discussions that you've had with these experts about the city's alert system and trying to make sure that people are evacuated from their homes before these types of major storms hit. So unfortunately, as we've discussed, Hurricane Sandy showed us just how important evacuating is, considering all of the Staten Islanders who lost their lives during the storm. Can you tell us just a little bit about the challenges that the city has had in alerting and evacuating residents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll start with this. I mean, storm communication is extremely difficult. There's a lot of moving parts. There's changing forecasts. Sandy's a perfect example. Very, very difficult storm to forecast. Took a sort of unexpected turn when some models were projecting to go out to sea and be harmless, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about the storm if that was the case. And then, of course, you have a massive amount of people, and then you have to assess things like risk management. How at risk are certain people? How bad are things going to be? And then you have to do it in a timely fashion. Those are all very, very hard things that the city has to come to grapple with. Translating that risk is difficult, but the city could definitely be doing a better job. That's for sure. We've seen more recently, after Ida came through, former Mayor de Blasio called for planning for the worst case scenario in every scenario. Almost immediately, experts who I spoke to disagreed with that plan. Mm-hmm. Basically, what de Blasio was insinuating was that when we have a storm, if we see a possible worst case scenario, let's just say that's going to be it, and let's evacuate people if the worst case scenario came true. The issue with that is people become fatigued. Mm-hmm. People will see an alert, and if something doesn't pan out, then you end up not listening to the next one that may have to pan out. And as a result, that could leave people ignoring a very, very important notifications that could save their lives. And then Eric Adams also has had his challenges in recent storms. Some people in storms, not necessarily on Staten Island, but in some other areas of the city, said that they didn't feel any more prepared, after Ida, which was another one of those wake-up call storms, just like Sandy was 10 years ago. And they felt like they weren't much more prepared than they were a year ago. So there's definitely a lot more that needs to be done. The city relies heavily on services like Notify NYC, services that don't include everybody. It requires people to subscribe, mm-hmm. and isn't always very geographically based. A lot of experts I spoke to had issues with that. In other words, sending an alert out to all of Manhattan or all of Lower Manhattan even isn't really that effective when there's a lot of people there and there could be different levels of risk. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, and part of it is sort of updating our technology and how we handle that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the over alerting aspect of it was interesting to me, because it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf, right? Or the mayor who cried hurricane here. It's like, you got to get out of your homes, and then there's no rain, and then you're like, oh, well, why do I have to listen to these? If he's going to say it every time it's going to rain a little bit, I'm not going to evacuate every time. So then you end up staying there, but you don't know when a real serious one is going to hit like this. Like you said with Sandy, there were some projections that didn't realize that it was going to be as severe as it was. And so it definitely is challenging for the city, and something that they need to improve on, but we'll see, what they can do to kind of do that. But,
yeah, we'll definitely keep an eye on that for sure.
Yeah, and so before we go, just kind of overall here, would you say that Staten Island is better prepared now to handle a major storm than it was when Sandy hit? And kind of what more needs to be done in that regard from your conversations with some of the experts?
I mean, that's a complex question. I mean, the overall broad answer, I think so. I mean, Sandy changed everything, really. I mean, it changed not only things for New York, but I mean, just in general of what the potential of these storms could be. And it sparked, obviously, all those projects that we mentioned that would have been necessary anyway, I think. But sometimes, I mean, just the way things are, you need, unfortunately, a major event to happen to make people realize, hey, we have to improve our resiliency. Still, while I think we're better protected, you also have to keep in mind that climate change currently isn't improving in any way. The Earth is still expected to get warmer. How much warmer it gets will directly correlate to how much worse some of these impacts are. So that's obviously something that's worrying. So it means that we're going to be facing more extreme storms, and then more often, which is another issue as well. So even if a storm doesn't reach the level of Sandy, having 2 or 3 of those storms in a year would obviously, to a single area, would be an issue. That's part of the equation that has to be considered. A whole wide range of things can be done. We could talk about expanding green infrastructure, which is something a lot of people have been talking about, which is something that happens more immediately. I mean, you hear things like storm sewers expanding and stuff like that. That stuff takes a lot of time. Time that, time that we may not really have in a lot of ways. Decades to really expand our hard infrastructure is going to be hard to do if we don't have other measures like expanding blue belts, using green infrastructure, making sure that we retain areas that are natural areas that absorb water, not building in areas that are gonna flood, which is still a problem. I mean, it's still an issue that we're facing. So there are things that we can do that wouldn't really shoot ourselves in the foot, like I mentioned about development, and then also not swallowing up natural areas that are pretty good at already at retaining water, and then also, I mean, it's a difficult process, but we see the importance of being able to collaborate across agencies. I mean, that's really what marred the East Shore Seawall. I mean, so many things in that project slowed it down, but part of it was that you had federal and then local officials, and things just moved very slowly.
We know how that goes.
Yes, and we have to, I think in general, as a city and as a country as well, be a lot better at sort of streamlining those things and making them happen in a more effective manner that can actually get things done. Because just saying we're making an East Shore seawall doesn't actually put the seawall in place.
Right, 10 years later.
Yeah, we have to actually have it in place. We have to have the living breakwaters projects happen sooner than it did. I mean, just starting in September is really unacceptable in a lot of ways. So yeah, so the answer is where we're getting there, but still so much more needs to be done in order to make sure that we're protected at a level that's, I think, acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Joe. It's always great to have you on, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Yep, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene. If you like what you've heard, please make sure to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit silive.com for the latest on all these stories and more. Thank you for supporting local journalism.